Okay, it's not too late. Now we're recording. Sorry. Okay. Sorry for folks that missed the first part. I'll re-record it or something. Anyway, you know that melody, that Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. You know that melody quite well because it's used everywhere. But it was actually composed in the early 19th century by a well-known cantor named Solomon Zulzer, who was the cantor in the Stadt Temple, the big synagogue in Vienna, which, by the way, is still functioning today. And you can go to services there if you're in Vienna, and they have a cantor and a choir there as well. And Zulzer is considered the father of the modern Cantoret. That is to say, the style that he developed in Vienna in the early 19th century is the style that became contemporary cantorial music. But he wrote that melody, we think. He certainly wrote it down. It may not have originally been his, but he wrote it because he wanted a nice little thing to do, not when we say the Shema in Shacharit, not in that block that I showed you earlier, but rather when we say it, when we take the Torah out on Shabbat morning. When we take the Torah out, we sing Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, and then we use that melody again. Echad Eloheinu Gadol Adonenu Kadosh Shemo, same melody. And it appears elsewhere as well. But that melody should not really be used when we're saying Shacharit, either on a weekday or on a Shabbat morning. Rather, you might want to use, going with the weekday Shacharit melody, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, because it fits into the nusach around it. Okay. Another example is that there's a separate melody that should be used on high holidays. Zulzer did not write this melody, but it is traditional. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Should be used only on Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and the end of the Shmini Atzeret, Simchat Torah. Those are the only times that we'll use that melody. That's the high holiday Shema melody. There are other melodies that we can use for Shema as well. I won't bore you with that, but let's go back to Kaddish, because this is a good one. There are Kaddishes in every service. Kaddish, by the way, liturgically speaking, functions as a kind of punctuation. Whenever you hit a Kaddish, you know you've come to an end point of a service and you're going on to a new one. So that's really what it is. It's a comma or a semicolon or a hard stop, sof pasuk, if you will. But okay, I'm gonna give you some. We could do this as a quiz and see how well you do. I'll just tell you what I'm singing. Okay. So first of all, weekday Shacharit. Yitkadav Yitkadash Shemei Rabbah. Okay, that is the weekday Shacharit in the Phragish mode, and that's using the weekday Phragish motif. Here's weekday minor that you'll hear a lot elsewhere in the Shacharit service, also at Mincha. Yitkadav Yitkadash Shemei Rabbah. Weekday minor. Okay. Shabbat Shacharit, a little more complicated than weekday Shacharit, but still. Anyway, it goes like this. This is in the minor mode before we switch into Phragish on Shabbat morning. Yitkadav Yitkadash Shemei Rabbah. Okay. By the way, that yadadadai, that is unique to Shabbat and should not be used with the weekday minor, although I hear some people doing that. Yitkadav Yitkadash Shemei Rabbah, Shabbat Shacharit. Shabbat Kriyat Torah, we already sang the Yitkadav Yitkadash Shemei Rabbah. That's you use on Friday night and when you finish the Torah reading. Here's Shabbat Musaff. Again, not as well known, although there are some members of Beth Shalom, some service leaders of Beth Shalom who do this. Shabbat Musaff, before we begin the Musaf Amidah, Yitkadav Yitkadash Shemei Rabbah. It's in major. So, by the way, in cantorial school, we used to refer to that one as the Ave Maria Kaddish because it has that Ave Maria. It has that same sort of sound. It's not sacrilegious to do that anyway. So that's Shabbat Musaff. By the way, in the Shabbat conclusion one, again, I hear in a lot of places where it probably should be used. Yitkadav Yitkadash Shemei Rabbah, classic major, should only be used really, or at least according to my Nusach teachers at the Jewish Theological Seminary, only at the end of Shabbat services, Shabbat morning services. Okay, so there's Shabbat. Here's a taste of high holidays, okay? You'll all recognize this one. Yitkadav Yitkadash Shemei Rabbah. So that should be used right before Musaf on the high holidays. Here's This one probably lesser known because fewer people are there in Shacharit. Yitgadal veyitkadash shemer Abba ve'alema divra kiruteh ve'amlich malchuteh v'chayechon v'yomechon v'chayechol beit Yisrael b'agalav zman kariv v'imru amen. That's High Holiday Shacharit. Here's High Holidays on the Torah. Oh, by the way, I'm sure you're wondering, first of all, why do you know all this, Rabbi Adelson? And second of all, is this written down anywhere? And the answer to the first question is, well, okay, some of you know clearly that I was a cantor before I became a rabbi. And number two, yes, it was written down. They forced us to learn all these things. In fact, I had one exam that was only on Kaddishes, right? I had to give me the okay, Adelson, give me the Kaddish for Yom Kippur Katan, and you had to know these things. So this is a book that you might have seen before called Ba'al Tefillah, or in German Der Praktische Vorbeter, which is written by Chazan Abraham Ber in the 1870s. And what Chazan Ber did, he was actually a cantor in Göteborg, also known as Gothenburg, Sweden, and he was the cantor there, but he was of German, have German background, and he in the 1870s he wanted to make sure that he wanted to see what all of his cantorial colleagues all over Europe were doing. So he wrote them all letters and say, hey, send me your music, and I'll put it all together in this great book. And so what he did was he cataloged every single thing that was used for every single service ever, every little piece of everything is all here, and published it. And by the way, he also shows variants. So sometimes it's probably hard for you to see, but there are sometimes alternate melodies. He'll say, for example, 1W, 2W, 3W. W means Weise, which I guess means version. And so different melodies. He'll also say, this is AW, Alta Weise, the old tune, and here's the Portugiesische Weise, the Portuguese tune, and there's also the Polnische Weise, PW, you'll sometimes see, versus DW, Deutsche Weise, the Polish versus the German. And he cataloged all these things and created a wonderful reference, so that if I want to know what the Kaddish is for when you finish the Torah reading on Yom Kippur, how does that go? And so I just look it up and go to the table of contents, and he'll direct me to wait, I have it marked here somewhere, to make sure I find the right one. And here it is. So this one says, top of the page, Chatzi Kaddish al Kriyat HaTorah. Kuf He means Kriyat HaTorah, or Achar Kriyat HaTorah, the Chatzi Kaddish after the reading of the Torah on Yom Kippur. And here it's written out, and there's his bell. Of course, he wrote it with Ashkenazi pronunciation, so it says, of course, Yiskadal v'Yiskadash. But anyway, so that's Ber, and back to the Kaddishes. That's the melody, again, one that you're not going to hear very much because only cantors know it, and most people do not know it. There's also the quote-unquote Hasidic Kaddish that you hear on holidays. Yitkadav veyitkadash shemer Abba. Really should only be used, I'm told, should only be used at the end of the service. So those are high holidays. There are some festival ones. I've probably spent too much time singing musical examples for Kaddish. But the point is, they're all different, and they should reflect the day and the time of day and the yes, I see. Yeah, you're talking about the Hasidic Kaddish. The time of day and what service it is, what type of day it is. All of that is reflected in the Nusach tradition, the tradition of Nusach HaTfilah. So, as I said, we know this. Remember, this was mostly an oral tradition until Ber wrote this down. Mostly it was an oral tradition. Last time I showed you the example of the first recorded musical notation by Ovadia Hager, which was 11th century, I believe, maybe 10th century, and that's the first time that music is written down. Otherwise, it had been a totally oral tradition, which is one reason why it varies from place to place. Now, where does it come from? I'm so glad you asked. So the simple answer is a lot of different places. So some things, as I said, would be very old. Hold on a second. All this talking and singing does make you thirsty. So where does it come from? So things that are very old, again, we don't know, for example, like take Kol Nidre. Kol Nidre is in the sphere of Misinai tunes. And there are variations within it, but it sounds roughly the same, with the same mode and the same motifs all over the Ashkenazi world, for sure. In many Sephardic communities, by the way, you all think Kol Nidre is important because you're Ashkenazim. Any non-Ashkenazim here? I don't think so. In the Sephardic world, the non-Ashkenazi world, it's really no big deal. You may know that rabbis for years have been trying to get rid of Kol Nidre because it's theologically problematic. Don't need to spend any time on that, but we're never going to get rid of it because it's just so good. But that is a Misinai tune. It probably was in circulation long before the 14th century. Okay, before things start to be written down on a regular basis. But once we start to see, once things are written down, that's 14th century and later, basically, we're able to kind of track where some melodies come from. So, and as I mentioned, music crosses cultural boundaries very easily. So there are some melodies in the Ashkenazi sphere of nusach, some nusachim, actually not just melodies, but nusach modes that actually come from Arabic modes. Now, how did they end up in Ashkenazi and Eastern European Jewish music of the synagogue? Well, so you may remember that the Ottoman Empire gets very deep into, if you know some history, it gets very deep into Europe. They conquer certainly into Hungary and parts of Poland in the 16th century. And I think it's 15th or 16th century, and of course the Ottoman Empire is Turkish, and the Turks have also, by the way, quite a lot of business going on in the Arab world as well. And so through the Turks, they bring melodies to the Poles, and when the Jews are living in Poland around the Poles, they pick up melodies like Hava Nagila, Hava Nagila. No, sorry. Hava Nagila was written in the early 20th century, but based on the Phrygian or Phrygish mode, which is the synagogue mode that we most associated with Shacharit. That melody is the same as Hava Nagila because it's in the same mode with some of the same motifs. That melody, that tune, that sounds to us very, I mean, you might think of it sounds very much like, Eastern European Jews, but more so, it actually sounds like Arabic music because it actually came from the East by way of the Turks. So from Arabia to Turkey to Poland to the Jews who were living there. So Pat asks, what about prayer endings? I hear people use what I think it was High Holiday Amen, descending minor triad during the rest of the year. I didn't find it very jarring. Yes. So yes, Pat, thanks for pointing that out. So the thing about the synagogue today, and this is again related to that assimilation issue, is that you'll hear people, not only the leader, but also the people participating will have different sounds going on. It's all sort of part of the mix. And sometimes, yes, I think what you're referring to is the amen that you often hear on high holidays, and maybe some people are using that on Shabbat as well. Yeah, I mean, I can't account for some people's musical taste, but yes, there's part of the whole sphere of how this came to be is what people hear and how they repeat it. The music of the synagogue is essentially like a giant ancient game of telephone, in the sense of we had some melodies that have stuck with us for a long time with relatively little change, some that probably became different as they were passed down from generation, some that were replaced entirely, and they also depend on the musical taste of the time. So what we're witnessing today, by the way, in the golden age of the Cantoret, which is late 19th century, early 20th century, there was a lot of emphasis on the traditional nusach. And by the way, that was what the Jews were used to hearing in synagogue, and they didn't necessarily want it to change. In the latter half of the 20th century, Jewish musical tastes changed quite dramatically. You don't really find a lot of, it used to be that every Jewish home had some cantorial records in it. That's just not something that people have anymore because they're listening to the same pop music that all other Americans are listening to. And by the way, they're accustomed to that, and that's the thing they like. And to some extent, that's what they want to hear in synagogue. So any good service leader is going to find a way to feed that meter as well as the traditional nusach meter as well. I mean, when I've taught my kids for their bar mitzvah, I'm working with my son Zev for his bar mitzvah, which will be in August. Im Yirtzeh Hashem, should God will it. I'm teaching him the traditional nusach before, and I did the same thing with my daughter to make sure they know the nusach roots before they substitute other melodies, which is what people often do. So it's good to know what the origin is before you change it. And a question about Phrygish mode sounds like a harmonic minor beginning on the third note of the scale, like the Phrygian mode. Yes, Audrey, I'm sorry, I guess I missed that. I should have explained that. The word Phrygish is a Yiddish, kind of a Yiddish slang that literally comes from the Greek word Phrygian, or Phrygian, as we often say in English, which refers to the Greek musical modes. They begin on the white keys of the piano. And the Phrygian mode is the one that begins, if you know anything about music or about piano, the scale that begins on the E key, which has a half step between E and F. So the first scale, the step from the first to the second scale tone is a half step, and that's what defines it. Hava Nagila, that note, there's a half step between this is the root and this is the second right there. Da, da, excuse me. Da, 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 da. That's the Phrygian mode, or in Yiddish, Phrygish. So thank you for that. So there are a couple of there are Misinai tunes, very old. There are things borrowed from Western music. There are things borrowed from Arabic music, and all of that is captured in Nusach HaTfilah. We did talk about the game of telephone. I want to give you actually a great musical example of how you might see this game of telephone play out. And this is literally over 1,000 years. Okay, so I'm going to give you a musical example. Excuse me. And this is a musical example that if you come to services at Beth Shalom, you're gonna recognize this right off the bat. The Shirat Hayam, the song of the sea that the Israelites sing upon having crossed the Sea of Reeds on dry land. So that's Exodus chapter 15. The song of the sea appears in our weekday liturgy. And as you know, at Beth Shalom, we sing it as follows. Az Yashir Moshe uvenei Yisrael et hashira hazot ladonai vayomeru lemor ashir ladonai ki gaoga sus verochevom rama vayam. When I was in cantorial school, I saw a copy of a paper written by Cantor and Macy Nolman, who was the teacher at the Yeshiva University Cantorial School in New York for a number of years. He was the dean, and he wrote a paper about how that melody sounds strikingly similar to a melody that we use for reading the Torah when we read Shirat Hayam. That melody goes like this. Okay, now you may not necessarily hear the same. They may not necessarily sound the same. This is, oh, by the way, I forgot to mention, the melody that we use at Beth Shalom is actually a Sephardic melody that is borrowed from the Western Sephardim. Those are the people who migrated in about the 10th or 11th centuries. There were Jews coming north from Italy. There had been primarily in Europe, Jewish settlement in Rome, right? And then in Italy, Jews moved forward into France. Some I actually should have put up a map of the world at this point, but just picture, here's Italy, here's France, here's Germany and Poland over here, okay? And here's Spain. I don't know if you can see that. Here's Spain. So the Jews are coming up from Italy. They're in the south of France. Some are going north. They're going north, and those are going to become the Ashkenazi Jews. Those are us. And there's some that are headed over here to the south and the west, and who end up in Spain, and those become the Spanish Sephardic Jews. And it must have been about 1,000 years ago, while this is happening, while those communities are separating, they had one melody, okay? And the way that melody developed in the Sephardic world was that it was sung together out loud, because in Sephardic communities, they always sing everything together, and they developed this melody. Ashir Adonai ki gaoga sus verochevo rama vayam. And that has a metrical sound to it, meaning it follows a kind of rhythm. Okay, rhythm makes it easier for people to sing together. When it's just logogenic, when it's just chanted words, it's hard to sing together. That's why Ashkenazim are always mumbling, a lot of mumbling Ashkenazi world. So that melody took a left and headed to Spain and developed that way. And then it also went north and wasn't used in the daily service, but was maintained whenever the Ashkenazim got to reading the Shirat Hayam, the Song of the Sea, that's Parshat B'Shalach, Shabbat Shirah. Also on the seventh day of Pesach, we read that as well. And we don't sing Ashir al Adonai ki ga in that metrical tune, but rather we sing Ashir Adonai ki ga sus v'rochavo ramavayam. Remember, they're not exactly the same. Ashir al Adonai ki ga sus v'rochavo ramavayam. Ashir Adonai ki ga sus v'rochavo ramavayam. But when you listen to them, they sound a little similar. And so Cantor Macy Ullman wrote this paper saying, they're probably the same melody, separated by about 1,000 years of Jewish telephone. Pretty cool, right? By the way, I gave that as a Devar Torah in my interview for when I applied to rabbinical school. And did I tell this story last time? Maybe I did. Rabbi, one of the deans turned to me and said, "Is that Torah?" And I said, "Of course it's Torah. It's music. It's all Torah." Okay, so that's a little bit of the history of how this has developed. The final piece I want to talk about, we have about 18 minutes. We'll talk about some of the tunes that we use. Tunes meaning congregational tunes, metrical tunes that people sing along to. Now remember, as I said, there's a lot of mumbling in the Ashkenazi world. And actually, the truth is, unlike the Sephardim, who typically sang everything together, the Ashkenazim didn't. I don't know why. I think it has something to do with the fact that, synagogues were never heated well in Poland. They didn't have good insulation. So everyone wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. I think, I don't know. But for sure, when you go to an Ashkenazi synagogue, to this day, there's a lot of mumbling. They're like, come on, people, we want to get through this. We want to get that really, by the way, is not how you should pray, just for the record. The Mishnah says you should make sure that there's kavanah in every word. You should make sure that you say words of prayer with kavanah. However, reality being what it is, and it's cold out, we got to get through this so we can, get to a warm place and, get to work or whatever. So there's a lot of mumbling. Traditional congregational singing was not really a big part of Ashkenazi worship until around the middle of the 19th century, when tunes start to be written. So really, if you think about it, middle of the 19th century is not that long ago. Okay, in Jewish time, that's like nothing. It's almost, it's the day before yesterday, and so almost all of the tunes that that you sing along, you think of this is traditional, it's from Sinai, almost all of those tunes that are really quite young. That Sephardic melody, that this Shirat Hayam melody, that's actually much older than anything that we sing together as a congregation. So that one is so old we don't know who wrote it, but still I'm sure it's not older than the 19th century. It's considered traditional, although traditional just means we don't know who wrote this. Somebody wrote it, but things that are traditional had to have originally had a composer. There are many composers of Jewish music. Another example, by the way, of a traditional melody is one that you know of as Adon Olam, that goes. I think of it as the old tune, right? Adon Olam Asher Malach B'Terem Kol Yitzir Nivra. Now, this is that melody as it was notated by Cantor Eliezer Gerovich, who lives in the late 19th century in Eastern Europe. Actually, he's Rostov on Don. So that's where's the Don River? That's Russia. So he lives in Russia in the Pale of Settlement, and he notated it, by the way, again, to that question of telephone. He notates it a little different, really, from the way we know it. He writes, I don't know if you can see this or not. Adon Olam Asher Malach B'Terem Kol Yitzir Nivra. A little different from the way we know it. But it's not clear that Gerovich actually wrote it. He was probably just writing down a melody that was already, even for him, traditional, but still probably emerges in the 19th century. Any tune, name a tune, it's written from sometime between the middle of 19th century and now, and most of the melodies that you know are 20th century. A few exceptions are Louis Lewandowski. Louis Lewandowski was the choir director at the Neue Synagogue in Berlin, the new synagogue. Oh, sorry. No, it's the my mistake. The Oranienburger Straße synagogue, which today you can see if you go to. It's actually in East Berlin, and the facade was the building was destroyed by the Nazis, but the facade is still there. So if you've been to Berlin lately, it's got this beautiful. They restored the facade. It's got these beautiful green and gold domes, and there in fact is a Masorti, a conservative congregation with a female rabbi, Rabbi Geza Ederberg, who is the rabbi there in Berlin. But that was Louis Lewandowski's synagogue in the middle of the 19th century, and they had a choir and probably an organ as well, though I'm not sure about that. And Lewandowski wrote many, many wonderful melodies that are still with us. And one example will be, I'm going to pull one up for you right now. So we're going to share sound, and we're going to do this. Just give me a second. So this melody, I'm sure you know, and this is a recording with Hazamir, the There are probably kids from Pittsburgh singing in this choir, although I can't pick them out. This is 2015. Okay, so that was Lewandowski's Sadi Katamar, which you can still hear in many synagogues today, but it's about 150 or 170 years old. Here's another Lewandowski tune that I know that I've heard people use at Beth Shalom as well, but it's a little less well known. But this is the choir from the Sharei Shamayim synagogue in Montreal with Cantor Gideon Zellermeyer, who I sang with when I was in the Jerusalem Great Synagogue Choir when I was there in my first year in Cantorial School in Israel. And this is an all-male choir, which is probably, by the way, how Lewandowski would have done it as well. I don't know if there were women in his choir or not.
מחזיקים בה ותומכיה אנושה דרכיה דרכנו וכל נתיבותיה
Okay, you get the idea, but that's Lewandowski, and Lewandowski's music still reverberates through much of many of the tunes that we use today. But of course, that's choral music, so it's not necessarily written for people to sing along, although that is one part of the sort of the Nusach HaTfilah experience of metrical tunes used in synagogue music. So perhaps you might be more familiar with, again, I gave the examples of Aleinu and Adon Olam. Those are things that many of us know. People take pop tunes and use them in services. I'm not, we were taught at the seminary that thou shalt not do that. I mean, a classic example, you'll hear many people sing Erev Shel Shoshanim, Israeli love song from the 1950s in Kedusha, for example. And I could think of Cantor Charles Davidson like shaking his finger at me and saying, thou shalt not. But people do that, of course, and that is I'm not going to say whether or not it's okay, the sky isn't fallen, but there are, of course, composers that compose specific music that is to be sung along with, and that is something, I don't know if I phrased that right. One example would be Debbie Friedman. Many of us are familiar with melodies that Debbie Friedman has created. A classic tune would be Ose Shalom Bimroma Vuyase Shalom Aleinu. That's Debbie Friedman. Or the Misha Berach that's very popular in the Reform world, although I don't hear it as much in conservative synagogues. Misha Berach Avotenu, etc. That's Debbie Friedman. There's also, of course, Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach, who composed many nigunim that are to be used, that are used, or I think that he intended for use also in services. Many Carlebach melodies, even if you don't know. Yes, you probably know many from if you've heard Kabbalah Shabbat melodies, but also melodies such as Veha Ereinenu B'Toratecha, that's Carlebach, or Harachamanu Yishlach Lanu Ad Eliyahu Hanavi. Also, again, like I said, the Kabbalah Shabbat suite of melodies that have been very popular in recent decades. So there are composers that compose for people to sing along with, in addition to composers who compose choral stuff. I think that the choral synagogue experience is one that has become harder to find nowadays. Do either Rodef or Temple Sinai use a choir today? I don't think they do. What about in the South Hills, Temple Emmanuel? Do they use a choir? Probably not. But in any case, it's unusual. Park Avenue Synagogue in New York, which I know I don't recommend this, but you can stream their services. A lot of people do it nowadays, but you should really be at Beth Shalom because our services are much better. But if you do tune into the Park Avenue Synagogue services, they do still have a paid choir, and they have had a longstanding tradition of commissioning their own music and so forth. Nowadays, of course, synagogues, the reason that most synagogues don't have choirs is because people actually like singing along, and they figure that when they come to the synagogue service, they want to participate. So they may not know the nusach, but it's easy. It's harder to learn nusach. That's sort of a top shelf kind of a thing. But the more accessible way is that everybody can sing along to Aleinu. I remember, by the way, just sort of a little personal anecdote here. When I was in cantorial, I was in rabbinical school, but I was working as a cantor at a little synagogue in Manhattan on 11th Street. And I wasn't usually, I was part-time. I mean, I did every Shabbat and every holiday, but I wasn't there during the week. But, once I went to a Shiva minyan, and the rabbi was there as well. And when we got to, so it's a Shiva minyan, and a Shiva minyan should not really be upbeat. Yes, Alva, thank you. That is correct, Leonard Bernstein. And also Kurt Weill was commissioned by Park Avenue Synagogue, and there were many great composers who they used to have like real money for that sort of thing. I don't know if they still do. But yes, I was at a Shiva minyan, and I got to Aleinu. And I think the sound of Aleinu is very kind of upbeat. Aleinu l'shabeach, it's a waltz. It to me, in my mind, it does not really suit the sound of what a Shiva minyan should sound like. So instead of singing Aleinu l'shabeach, I just mumbled Aleinu l'shabeach, in weekday minor. And afterwards, the rabbi said, people want to sing along. I was like, oh yeah, I guess you're right. So again, there's always a matter of choice involved, and sometimes some of the friction between rabbis and cantors is about tunes and what you're singing and what you're not singing. I am fortunate that being both a rabbi and a cantor, all of my conflicts are internal in that regard. We got a couple minutes left. Does anybody have any questions that things that you thought I should cover that I didn't cover, or anything you want to ask about synagogue music but were afraid to before? Our next session is going to be about, in particular, about chazanut, about cantorial music. So we'll play some cantorial examples and listen to that stuff, and some of that should be pretty cool. And so, if there are no other questions, I will say thank you for joining us today. I actually have to go to another meeting in 2 minutes, but it's a pleasure spending a few moments learning about Nusach and listening to some great music with you all. So I will see you all soon.
Yashikal, Rabbi.
Thank you.